And welcome to the first in a series of market spotlights by DC Byte. I'm joined here today by my analyst, Teresa. Teresa looks after the Singapore, Australia and New Zealand markets, and today, the first in a series of these market spotlights, will be focusing on the report which I'm sure some of you saw last week, A Tale of Two Cities, which focuses on the often overlooked markets in Australia, Melbourne and Canberra. So, Teresa, why did we do the spotlight on Melbourne and Canberra?
Yeah, so basically when we hear discussions on Australia's data center market, we often talk about, Sydney first comes to mind, right? Of course, it's a tier 1 market, a regional hub, but we don't really hear too much conversations going on about Melbourne and Canberra or the other metros in the Australian market in general. And so geographically, Melbourne and Canberra are two cities that are pretty close to Sydney, and they are also two sort of growing data center markets in the region. So just some quick facts. For example, Canberra is of course the capital city of Australia. It is the seat of the government, housing a population of about 500,000 people. Whereas for Melbourne, it is the capital city of the state of Victoria, and it houses a population that's way bigger than Canberra at about 5 million people. So as I mentioned earlier, these two data center markets have also been experiencing pretty impressive rates of growth over the past 5 years, and so I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to kind of compare and contrast these two markets.
Yeah, well, Canberra, it's often the topic of pub quizzes. What is the capital of Australia? People always go Sydney or Melbourne, but as you mentioned, it is indeed Canberra.
Yeah.
So obviously you mentioned Melbourne, 5+ million people, Canberra, 500,000 people. Right now, how do these two markets compare in terms of market capacity?
Yeah, great question. I think it would be the best if I actually showed you via our platform. So to introduce, this is our DC Byte platform. We have a page for every market, every data center market. And right up front, we are able to see the highlights of the market at one glance. In terms of the market size, it tells us that Melbourne, for example, we can see that it sits at 794 megawatts of total capacity. The vacancy rate sits at 20%, and that's among the live co-location capacity only. And pretty much we are able to see that it's still predominantly a co-location market. And when we stack that up with Canberra, for example, we see that the market size is slightly smaller, but what I would like to point out is that the absolute volume of live IT megawatt in the two markets are pretty similar, even though just now we mentioned that the population sizes differ quite a bit. So for Canberra, that presently sits at about 125 megawatts of live IT capacity. Mm-hmm. Whereas for Melbourne, that sits at 172 megawatts, which is pretty comparable, even though, the markets are sized so differently. Okay,
interesting. And like one thing which people who aren't quite familiar with the DC Byte platform, they may see this 794 megawatt number versus, what was it for Canberra? Can you flick back?
Yeah, 165.
165, but the total IT capacities are comparable. Mm-hmm. Why does Melbourne have the much bigger build pipeline? Like, what's driving that?
So the much bigger pipeline is actually given the different kinds of builds that we are about to see in the market. But I think you actually touched on a really important point that we do have sort of different categories for the pipeline capacity. So just to perhaps delve into this a bit deeper, we do break down the capacity into categories like under construction, which is basically space that is currently being built out, capacity that is currently built out, committed, which are basically schemes that we know have the necessary resources that will be built to be built, or it can also refer to things like powered shells.
Okay.
And we also have capacity that's like in the early stages, which are basically schemes that have been announced, but we've yet to really confirm whether they've got the necessary land and resources required to then build the data center. So in the terms of what you mentioned about this difference between Melbourne and Canberra, for Canberra, the live IT load has mostly been built out. We don't really see too much of the pipeline capacity coming apart from a few developments by, for example, DCI data centers. Whereas in Melbourne, we see a lot of activity. For example, we see the entrance of new players such as Stack Infrastructure. So really quickly, let me pull out this page for the Stack Infrastructure build. So Stack Infrastructure previously announced their partnership with Hickory Data Centers, and one of their projects is actually based in Melbourne, where they've got a total build project of 72 megawatts. I believe they are building this in 2 phases with 36 megawatts each. We are also seeing that this is the growth in Melbourne is also being fueled by players such as Microsoft. So Microsoft are also embarking on self-builds within the Melbourne market, and this is also set to change the market composition of the market now that we are talking about it. Yeah. So I think that's actually really well illustrated by one of our graphs. So for example, if we see in the Melbourne market, right now it's still pretty much a co-location-driven market. If we just consider the live megawatts, so that presently makes up about 94% of the live IT megawatt load. But when we take into consideration all the pipeline capacity that's streaming into Melbourne, we are going to see that this co-location share of the market is set to shrink to about 79%, with the self-builds now sort of ballooning to 21% of the entire market.
And when we talk about these self-built public clouds, we're really talking about AWS and Microsoft here, aren't we?
Yeah, well, pretty much. I think the Western players are most active in Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, so, well, like that's an interesting one. Like we've seen, and it's been kind of widely reported over the last, I suppose, year or two, that the Melbourne is now where AWS, Microsoft, etc. are setting up their regions to complement what they may already have. So obviously, I think the report highlights where the regions, both predominantly Western, as you mentioned, but is also Chinese cloud presence in Sydney. Sydney has got all the big public clouds. Canberra does obviously have a Microsoft region, and Melbourne now is kind of following the suit that Sydney saw, which is why I think we can see this huge pipeline of growth.
Yeah.
So one thing which, just going back a step to the live IT loads in both cities, I think Melbourne is 175, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 172, pretty close.
Well, 172, and then Canberra is 125, is that right?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3. Okay, in the right ballpark.
Yeah.
One interesting thing, like how does this compare the megawatts per capita numbers? Because I always think this is an interesting number to look at to get a sense of how developed the market might be.
Yeah, definitely. I think given that we've also been bringing up the fact that, even though these two markets are pretty comparable in terms of their live IT load, they serve sort of differently. They sort of serve different size populations. So just as a basis, to provide a basis of a comparison, the number for the live IT megawatt per capita for Australia-wide is presently sits at 34 megawatts. So 34 megawatts live IT, well, that's quite a tongue twister, 34 megawatts of live IT load per million capita.
Okay.
So when it comes to Melbourne, that sits at slightly below that country average of about 26 megawatts of live IT load per million capita. Now when you stack that up with Canberra, for example, that's like sitting about 10 times more at 273 megawatts of live IT load per million capita.
Okay, so just looking at pure population numbers, Canberra is massively overrepresented by like almost a factor of 10. Why is there so much capacity in Canberra if it's such a small city?
Yeah, so you brought up a great point. So basically, we've seen that these two markets actually serve pretty different clientele profiles. As we know it, Melbourne is a pretty big business and technology financial hub. There are multiple, multinational corporations which are headquartered there, some of the big national banks as well. And these companies would naturally require co-location sort of capacity, or if they have a cloud strategy, they would then sort of provide the demand for the cloud service providers, who then take a capacity with the co-location facilities, or they do their self-builds, as we showed earlier. When it comes to Canberra, it is the seat of the government, and it is also headquartering important institutions such as the Australian Defence Force. So the Australian government is a pretty big customer of demand colocation capacity in Australia, and that is actually has fueled most of the growth in the Canberra market. And so, with that being said, while Melbourne is serving sort of population and business demands, the Canberra market is actually serving a lot of the government demands instead.
Okay, so you've kind of touched upon the next question I was going to ask. And we've discussed to date so far that the live capacity in both cities is broadly similar, like not too much difference between the two. What does the pipeline look like? Am I correct in saying that it looks like Melbourne is going to be the busier of the two cities and is probably going to be I suppose a complement to Sydney moving forward?
Yeah, pretty much. I think as we mentioned earlier, there's loads of capacity in the pipeline beyond the co-location growth with like people like Stack, the players like Stack and Hickory, as well as the cloud service providers going in with their new builds. We are set to see the market really growing in the years to come, whereas maybe Canberra, we don't see as much of new projects coming into the pipeline.
Okay, so like the Australian government, they were very early adopters in the cloud first strategy, I think.
Yeah,
so
pretty
I think,
much.
Yeah.
I think their policy was first rolled out in 2014. Actually.
Yeah, 2014. So yeah, they're coming up to 10 years of this cloud first
Yeah.
policy or this cloud first strategy. So yeah, I think that's why that goes back to that figure that you mentioned earlier of 273 megawatts per million capita, which very few metros or very few countries I can think get close to that number.
For sure.
Okay, well, yeah, it sounds like Melbourne is if you're kind of in the data center space in Melbourne or supplier to the industries, there's a lot going on, especially with those with the cloud players kind of really ramping up their presence there. What are the kind of the key, I suppose, the takeaways or comparisons, just as we kind of wrap this session up? Like, what are your final thoughts on these two markets?
Yeah, so I think so far with what we've discussed is pretty much that these two Australian cities, even though they are not quite the primary market of Sydney, they still have witnessed a lot of growth in the past few years, and they are definitely ones to look out for. Melbourne, of course, being with the amount of pipeline capacity in the works, is definitely one that we should all be keeping on our books to take a look on. But with that being said, again, we emphasize that Melbourne serves a very different clientele profile as compared to Canberra. Again, Melbourne serving more population and business demands, whereas Canberra serves, the government demand essentially. Yeah, so I think with that being said, sort of zooming out into a wider APAC context, I think these two cities actually are a really interesting case of sort of the secondary metros kind of blossoming. In the absence of what seems like, traditionally we've seen primary markets sort of reaching challenges with land and power constraints or things like government interventions of moratoriums before we then see sort of trends of decentralizations or sort of the operations moving to secondary metros. But in the case of Australia, this seems to be happening pretty much devoid of all these challenges. So definitely an interesting case study to look out for.
Yeah, and the kind of the wider APAC context, as you mentioned, generally the capital city is where most of the co-location capacity, like think Japan, where Tokyo is the dominant market there, or really any of the other markets. It's really all centered around the capital city in most cases. Jakarta, Indonesia, Manila, Philippines, Bangkok, Thailand. Osaka is maybe one in Japan where there are some parallels with the constraints that you mentioned in Japan. That market is growing quite quickly, kind of mirroring Melbourne, I suppose, to a degree. Mm-hmm. But Teresa, that's been really useful. I hope everyone who's watched today has found that useful. Like I said, Melbourne and Canberra are two. I think they are now getting more and more interest from the operators, from the funds, for really anyone involved in data centers. But I think a bit of context and how they compare to each other, and then of course to, I suppose, their big brother Sydney is an interesting comparison.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, there is a accompanying report that goes along with this, which Teresa wrote. The PDF link will be down below.
Yeah, it will be.
It will be somewhere. You'll be able to find it. And Teresa will also be presenting something similar at the W Media event in Melbourne in May, right?
Yeah, that's in the first week of May. So yeah, please do reach out if you are happening to visit the city or you will be at the event. We would love to have a conversation about, well, Melbourne market, the Australian market, or any market in the data center industry in general.
Yep. So as I mentioned, this is the first in the series of these monthly spotlights we're doing. We do track 6,100, well, over 6,100 facilities all over the world. We will be launching our North and South America data sets. That's very soon. So these market spotlights will be jumping around different regions, different cities, different markets. Next up, I think we're staying in APAC for the next one. So I think the next market spotlight is going to focus on the I suppose the spillover markets, if you want to call them that, of Batam in Indonesia and Johor Bahru in Malaysia, which, for those of you not familiar with these markets, they're basically serving as overspill markets for Singapore right now, given the moratorium and the various constraints which the Singapore market faces. So that'll be myself and Vivian delivering that session. Yeah, about a month from now, a month from when you're watching this. So thanks everyone for watching. Like I said, the report can be found. Please feel free to circulate, and if there's any queries or questions on the Australian market, on the wider APAC market, or indeed on any data center market globally, please do get in touch. We'd be happy to help with our market intelligence.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.